Welcome to Navigating Carbon, your compass to carbon management. I'm your host, Deb Ryan, and in this episode of Navigating Carbon, I am doing a deep dive on halocarbons and methane carbon credits with Jenny Morgan from Tradewater. Jenny is passionate about the work that she's doing, which hopefully you'll hear through the conversation that we have. And as the market development manager for Tradewater, she's focused on raising awareness about avoiding these non-CO2 greenhouse gases and how we develop this market. During our conversation, Jenny also references some articles and references, which I've included below in the show notes for you. As always, if you want to hear more of these conversations and discussions that I have, please like and subscribe to the feed so that you don't miss any upcoming episodes. But for now, sit back and please enjoy my conversation with Jenny. Hi, and welcome to the Navigating Carbon podcast. My name's Deb Ryan, and today I'm joined by Jenny Morgan from Tradewater. Jenny, how are you? Good to see you.
I'm doing very well. Happy to be here. Thank you so much.
Yeah. So today, I know you and I have talked about some of these things in the past, but we really wanted to dive in and start untangling some of the misconceptions in the carbon markets and pull apart some of these topics that we continually hear time and time again kind of popping up. So I'm really excited to dive in and see where we head with this. So it should be fun. So I wanted to kind of start with if you wanted to give the audience a little bit of an overview about who Tradewater is and, what you guys are doing and where you play in the market specifically. So
Sure. Yeah, so Tradewater is focused on ensuring that we prevent non-CO2 gases from entering the atmosphere. So if you think about the carbon market and somewhat of a binary list of types of projects, we're in the avoidance space. We're trying to ensure that these high potency global warming potential gases do not enter the atmosphere in the first place. And unfortunately, these gases, if we don't avoid them being emitted, it's very challenging to scale sequestering them after emission, sometimes impossible or sometimes incredibly difficult. And so the best option is to avoid their emission from the start. So our two primary focuses are preventing and destroying halocarbons. So those are ozone depleting substances that if they leak, they can warm the planet at 7,000 to 10,000 times faster than carbon. And then we also address methane by plugging orphaned oil and gas wells. Methane is a high contributor of global warming right now. It also has a lot of negative impacts on ground, soil, air quality, things of that sort. And so that project type is one that we're heavily focused on as well.
And I think it's a really important thing to sort of just spend a little bit of time on, because when people hear carbon markets, or even when people are hearing like carbon intensity or emissions and stuff like that, everyone automatically goes to CO2. But right. there are these other gases that are included as part of the greenhouse gases that, make up global warming, like you said, and they can be quite catastrophic, and much more so than CO2. So the fact that you guys, even though it's an avoidance versus, it's quite hard to, like you said, remove these gases once they're actually in the atmosphere, so we have to avoid them, versus the idea of a removal from a CO2 perspective. So it's a really interesting kind of piece of the market, I think, that is I think is kind of often overlooked. So I don't know if you agree with that, but
yeah, I think because of the state of the world we are in right now, a lot of interested parties want to rewrite what's been done, meaning that they're focusing a lot on removals. And nature has a huge impact on the way that our planet will experience climate change now and in the future. And so it's important to note that I think it's a combination of activities that will help us curb climate change. However, if you think about that bathtub analogy where you've got the faucet on and it's starting to overflow the tub, the first thing that you're going to do is turn the faucet off. Then you're going to go grab towels and make sure you're cleaning up the mess and figuring out what to do with that water that's sitting in your bathroom. And so it would be both. You would never only select to do one. And so I think we're all very focused on cleaning up the mess and, collecting the water if we're continuing this bathtub analogy. But turning the faucet off is a huge way to help us succeed. And so I think it's often overlooked, but those that are really spending the time to educate themselves and are a bit more comfortable with a holistic type of climate strategy, they're gravitating towards projects like Tradewater's.
Yeah. No, I love that analogy as well, because like you said, it really kind of highlights the need to do both before, that horror scenario, right, where the bathtub falls through the roof into the room below.
Right.
So, yeah. So, as you guys are doing these projects, particularly given that they're in, looking at these other gases and stuff, one of the things I think, and you and I have talked about this before, is really around pricing and carbon pricing. So can you kind of start with what is some of the confusion that you've really seen around pricing these kind of avoidance projects in the market?
Yeah, so a credit might seem like one entity or one commodity. And so at times buyers will approach the market in that type of mindset. However, it's the complete opposite. Carbon price there's an enormous scale of various prices, which could be dependent on quality. It could be dependent on the region or the project type. And so that creates a bit of confusion, especially you somewhat alluded to this earlier, where we use this blanket term of CO2 credit, and we do that to make it a bit more simplistic, but then the carbon market is the opposite of simplistic, where there's a lot of different things and climate change is the opposite of simplistic as well. So again, it's like this holistic grouping of projects that can help us succeed. And so when a buyer comes to the market and they're considering various prices, they might be thinking of just carbon and then coming in and kind of seeing this wide range. They may also be thinking of it from a greenhouse gas, but a methane landfill project versus a methane plugging of an orphaned well project are entirely different. Going back to Tradewater's work as well, ozone depleting substance being destroyed permanently versus a refrigerant being reclaimed, meaning it's being resold back into the market. You may think just at face value that those are similar project types, but they're completely different. One is eliminating it from the source for it to permanently never leak into the atmosphere, whereas one is preventing further production. However, it's keeping the gas out in the world and being used. And so nuance is very difficult to manage unless you have the resources and the time and the space to be able to address it. And so I think it's this nuance that is difficult for buyers to really navigate and kind of understand what they should do next or who they should trust when they're going to buy these credits.
Yeah. And I think, you talked about how when people look at pricing across the carbon markets, it's very broad, but even within more specific buckets, methane avoidance, industrial pollutant avoidance, there is still a significant amount of nuance in those things. There are a lot of sources and, ways that these gases get into the atmosphere. And methane's a really good example. You gave the industrial pollutant kind of example, but methane comes from landfill, it comes from farms, it comes from oil and gas, it comes from all these comes from coal mining, comes from lots of different sources, and they're very different processes as well. Very much similar to the nuance with the recycling of the halogen industrial products as well. So
yeah. And there's also the quality question too. There was a recent Bloomberg article that the headline was, companies are no longer willing to buy cheap credits. And that, because I am in the industry and I'm speaking about this on a continual basis, I understand the messaging behind that headline. However, if I'm a buyer, it's very subjective on how I'm interpreting cheap. Is cheap inexpensive? Is cheap based on the quality? Is cheap based on regional costs? And so it's been something that I think the media plays into this confusion a bit, where, the market itself is looking to achieve this level of high integrity, high quality, high transparency. However, there's this messaging behind cheap or inexpensive not being quality enough, or very expensive being not scalable. Those things might be blanket statements to make, but that in no way makes them true. You have to really dive into the nuance and use various resources to be able to navigate the space.
Yeah.
So yeah, price is tough.
It is, but it goes to the next piece. Even just with this article that you're referencing, corporate standards and how companies are thinking about, using the carbon markets in their own, carbon management, net zero, emissions reduction targets, whatever you want to call them, does vary, and it's all over the place a little bit. And so as you're talking to buyers and stuff, like, how do you see, some of that confusion and comparison and stuff also playing out around corporate standards?
Yeah, well, it's Tradewater's belief, and also the belief of many experts in the industry, that your first priority should be reducing your own emissions and then offsetting the rest. The balance between that is very key in ensuring that we're continuing to achieve progress while also addressing emissions today. And so it has to be both. Silvera has a blog post that I refer to all the time about how it's questioning if offsets are permission to pollute. And the reason why I love that study is because it was very extensive. They studied all of these different organizations to determine whomever is buying offsets and whoever is not. Are they actually kind of covering up their emissions, and are they using it as a band-aid versus an actual strategy? And time again, the study proves that those that purchase offsets actually decarbonize at twice the rate of those that do not. And so it's used as an asset. So first thing I just wanted to address is that a quality corporate standard should be one that has an emission reduction strategy along with a carbon, buying carbon credits to compensate for those gaps, which there will always be gaps. Us being on this podcast is creating emissions. And so there's these standards. So then now they're going to be purchasing credits. And so what should they be thinking about is quality. And what is quality? So things that I think about are additionality. Will the interference of this project, will the application of this project actually add an additional climate benefit? And can that be proven? So that's very easy to do with an analogy of, here's a tree. You can't just point at it and say, here is a climate benefit. This produces a credit. Now, if that tree was about to be cut down and you have stopped that from happening, that interference and that project is now adding additional value. And so additionality is key for a quality project. Permanence is another one. So how are we able to prove that this act will reap the investment? So is there an ROI to this project and to this purchase? Is it quantifiable? So is there a methodology in place that can make it very easy to quantify the impact? And that also can help with, making sure that it's not overestimated. And then I would say additional things that, corporates are really gravitating towards is there a true partnership? Is it verified? Is the project developer being incredibly transparent in the way that they work? And that way they're really viewing them as a collaborator versus just simply that commodity.
I think that's an area where we've seen companies getting more involved, and like corporates that want to buy credits is not necessarily doing the carbon projects themselves, but getting much more involved in how those credits are being generated and making sure they can guarantee and have that transparency around the methodology and some of that kind of stuff. That's seems to have been, it's sort of an increasing trend we definitely see in this space. And I assume that's something you guys are seeing as well.
Oh, yeah. I mean, we have customers that come to destruction facilities. They come to our warehouse. We've had people do well site visits. So I think that's a key indicator of how much. I mean, any corporate that's going to partner with anything, any vendor, any supplier is going to do that similar amount of due diligence. And so we should be expecting that same amount of, high touch partnership in the carbon market as well.
Yeah. One of the other piece on the corporates I'm curious as to your opinion about, particularly given that, the industrial nature of the projects that Tradewater is working on, is I think early on in this space, there was a lot of, challenges sort of thrown at companies around buying carbon offsets from, whether it's, forestry projects or other things, and particularly in other parts of the world that maybe weren't related to their own operations. And so I'm curious if you see an interest in these more industrial type credits for particularly, companies in the oil and gas space, in some of these, hard to abate industrial sectors. Like, do you see that they're drawn to these kind of credits as well because it aligns with their projects and with their work and with their business as well?
Yeah. I'm going to be honest with you. It's really a mixed bag of how people come to what credit aligns with their actual, whatever protocol they're utilizing to measure or account for their emissions. The big gap is that a lot of organizations aren't measuring their emissions that come from halocarbons. So they aren't measuring the emissions from their refrigerants or their halons. And so they might be aware that they're using ozone depleting substances or even a more modern version of these gases. However, the impact of them is not being measured. So it really depends on the level of awareness that the buyer has, how elaborate their reporting and their accounting is. If they account for these gases appropriately, it will also show a spike in their emissions because they're actually being forthright in all of their emissions. And so that's been honestly a struggle at times, just because if they're not reporting on it, then it somewhat doesn't exist, which is false. It's kind of like selling a house and not disclosing that one bedroom is covered in mold. We all use refrigerants. If you have any sort of temperature control in your office or in your manufacturing site or in your refrigeration system, you are using a refrigerant, and depending on the age of that refrigerant will depend on the amount of global warming it's causing. Same with halons. If you're using a fire suppressant of some sort, that is going to have an emission rate to it, and a global warming potential rate to it. And so it really depends on who the individual is. One thing that I've found surprising with working with buyers is they're still a human. They're still a human being that has determined where they're gravitating towards and whom they're, whose opinion they respect or admire and who they're thinking about and listening to. And so I've really appreciated Project Drawdown's effort in sharing the negative impacts of ozone depleting substances and methane, because it's really spiked that level of awareness around the world.
That's really cool. And I think, coming from oil and gas myself, like we sort of saw this evolution on the methane conversation, where, people actually had to go through that reconciliation of actually, now that I am looking at my methane through lots of different sources and stuff like that, we did see that spike. And now people are actually, quantifying it, better, not going to say properly, but better, so that we can actually, see that improvement. And so hopefully we'll see that in the industrial pollutants and stuff like that, the refrigerants and stuff like that as well. So but it can be scary for folks if it's going to go up first before it comes down. So.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I'm not in the GHG accounting space, and so I empathize with those that are trying to navigate that, especially when you're starting to consider scope 3. But I mean, there's 11 billion tons of CFCs out there in the world right now. A lot of times we find them shoved into pod containers simply because they aren't being used, and individuals know that they are so harmful to the planet and they cannot be destroyed just, from you and I can't just destroy a refrigerant through our, recycling or waste management system. And so a lot of folks don't really know what to do with them. And so if we could raise awareness around addressing them immediately, we can prevent 11 billion tons of a 10,000 GWP gas from entering the atmosphere. I mean, it's completely unnecessary to leak that.
Yeah. And then the other thing I wanted to pick up on that you mentioned a little bit before was some of, the idea of quality of credits. It's been an ongoing conversation in the market for nearly, it's ongoing, but for 2 years in particular, there's been a really, really strong focus on defining quality, bringing that transparency to methodologies. And we've seen things like the core carbon principles or the CCP labels starting to emerge and stuff. But I think, what's your view in terms of, is that helping? Is it still bringing a lot of confusion? Like, where are we progressing in terms of that, transparency around quality?
Yeah, I think, again, I'm not picking a side. I do think it's both. So I'm very excited. The pro side of the CCP approval and the increase in transparency in the market is very exciting to me. I think that means also that those in power are listening, which means that there's a evolution that's ongoing and we're actually watching it in real time. And so I love that there's going to be such an extensive review of the various methodologies. And I mean, not even focusing on like the quantification potential of these methodologies, but it also expands it to meaning, are these projects going to do harm elsewhere that aren't even being reported on? And so it takes a really holistic lens on, is this work adding to the fight against climate change? And so I really like that. It addresses all of the typical complaints of the carbon market. I think the issue with it, and time and education are the gaps here. But I think the issue is that it's taking time to review all of the methodologies. And so they're slowly being trickled out. And so it's creating this divide between these are CCP approved and these are all the rest of them. And the rest of them doesn't mean that they, one, won't be approved or that they're a poor quality credit. And so once you set a standard, everyone wants that standard. And I want to make sure we're also realizing that we're watching this process in real time. And so encouraging buyers to still remain open and curious about projects that might not receive that approval rating within 2024. I mean, Tradewater has been lucky because one of our primary project types has already been approved. However, it might take another 12 months for our methane abatement work to be approved, simply just because they're going through a very thorough process. And so does that mean that we shouldn't be addressing the greenhouse gas that is 25% of our emissions right now? No, we should definitely be doing that. And so, I think it's a great thumbs up. If it's been rejected, that might cause a red flag that you should be thinking about, understanding why. But otherwise, if it's still eligible and has a high credit rating, and there's those that are in the industry have also recommended it, and those are individuals that you trust. If you've done your due diligence, then I think it can be both. Yeah.
And I saw an article a couple of days ago put out by the ICVCM, so the Integrity Council for the Voluntary Carbon Market, that oversee the CCP process. Again, so many acronyms in this space, but that's okay. And I think, they reiterated something that you said, and it's like, just because something doesn't get that certification maybe straight away, even if that's rejected initially, it's sort of more supposed to be like, okay, well, here's also the things that you can do within that methodology to get it to that standard. And so it's just giving people that sort of goal to get to, and it's not ever like, it's like, okay, it's going to be an evolution. Because I would agree. I think I've had a lot of conversations with people where we sometimes let perfect be the enemy of the good in this space, and that's problematic. Like, because then it's not that we shouldn't be doing anything, but we need to just be constantly improving and aware of what that process looks like. So I can see you nodding, but yeah.
Yeah. I mean, if an action is creating a positive impact and it's scalable, then that's where we should be gravitating towards, and then continuing to build up, that guarantee of an investment. Because, I mean, these buyers have a right to know where their money is going and if it's truly addressing climate risk and business risk, because that's synonymous. And so, yes, we should be, I think that's kind of where we go back to the project developer's willingness to be a partner. Mm-hmm. So sharing if there has been any modifications because of criticisms of a methodology or areas for improvement, ensuring that we're being very conservative in our reporting. I would hate that this delay in process, even though it is a positive one, I would hate to see project developers that can't wait due to their finances lose ground and go out of business. We're already seeing that today. And so there's really quality project developers and project leads that don't have the luxury of waiting for an approval.
Yeah, and a perfect system and a perfect process. So
right.
Yeah. So one of the other things I wanted to cover with you before we jump off is this kind of idea around like the cancel culture in the climate space. I know it's a topic that you're quite passionate about. So can you, just to start, can you define for everybody, when you say cancel culture in the climate space, what do you mean by that?
I mean that you prioritize disagreement or discourse over action. So instead of noticing where there's a project developer that does one project type and you do another, instead of trying to sell to, I'm trying to use this hypothetical to apply it to our conversation, trying to sell to a buyer by criticizing the other project as not being as efficient as yours actually does the entire climate movement a disservice, including yourself. So I've seen that type of ego get into our way of actually pushing us towards progress. And so that is where I've been very vocal in how we engage and embrace others rather than making climate action exclusive. And we've done that in the past, and I'm very vocal on trying to prevent that from continuing.
I think it's a huge challenge as well, because it's going to take a lot of different players in this space to solve a very large problem. So to your point, like, how does everyone work together and bring together all the pieces of the market versus trying to, stake out their own little piece and that kind of stuff. It's going to be a whole ecosystem that's going to take, more than just any one single company, I think, to solve this problem. So that's kind of, where you're kind of leaning of like, how do we actually work together and what does that look like? So
yeah, I think that spans across industry, companies, schools of thought. And so, I mean, you see a lot of it where it's, removal versus avoidance, or decarbonization versus carbon market. I mean, you can get very big or niche. That's why I really like that the Integrity Council, when they are somewhat critical of a methodology, they're providing paths forward rather than quote unquote canceling these methodologies. They're actually applying some, ways that they will no longer be deemed not the best methodology. Yeah. And so that's positive.
Yeah, again, working collectively to the end goal, which is to reduce greenhouse gas emissions in the atmosphere, right?
Yes.
So, yeah, very cool. Well, Jenny, thank you so much for joining me today. I think this has been a fabulous conversation. We've covered a lot of ground, and really kind of, I think, dived pretty well into, what's causing a lot of the confusion in the market today. So yeah, I really appreciate it. Thank you for your comments.
Thank you. I appreciate it too. Thank you so much.